So I'm guessing there's very little reason to go over why we don't want oil on the coasts in this room. I'm assuming since you came out, there's a good chance that you are already on side on that, and so I'm not going to go into the reasons why we wouldn't want oil on the coast. But I would say that it's important to think about the way that those reasons work themselves out. And I think those reasons fall into two main categories. So if we can assume that everyone in the room here is kind of worried about oil on the coast, and perhaps the lessons that the spill might have for the coast, for us, then we think about the reasons we might not want oil on our coasts. Now the first is that we don't want an oil spill. We're afraid of oil spills. So we look around and we say, look what happened down there, that's a disaster, we don't want oil on our coasts because that could happen here. And the second one, and this was the reason we didn't want oil on our coast for so long, as you all well know. But the second one, which is probably in more of our consciousnesses over the last decade, is global climate change, which would mean we don't want oil at all, right? Which I think is a sort of fairly non-controversial thing to assert these days. And the reason I bring this up, I think that in terms of thinking about our policy and political options coming forward out of this, and looking at the lessons we can learn from the Macondo spill, from the Deepwater Horizon spill, it's important to think about these two reasons, because one of our biggest challenges, I would argue, is articulating them. Because there are two concerns, I think, that we need to bring to bear here. The first is that if we focused on the first reason as an opposition to oil on our coasts, i.e. we're worried about spills here in British Columbia, we're worried about a Deepwater Horizon here in British Columbia, we're worried about tanker traffic and a tanker wreck on the coast, implicit, if we leave the message at that, is that in general, the system in which the petro-industrial complex, if you want to call it that, or some big fancy word, is embedded, is okay. The problem is risky oil development. But oil development per se is not necessarily put in question when we mostly focus on the fear of spills. But in the second reason, which would be a concern about oil because of larger climate change issues, would put us in a situation where we have to think a little bit differently about the political landscape, I would argue. For one thing, and I think this is one of its benefits, is it makes any demand for the end of oil on our coasts much less provincial. And I mean that in both the geographical sense and also in the provincialism, small-mindedness sense. It makes our demands to end oil traffic or oil exploration or oil drilling on our coasts implicit. It embeds it in the larger system of which oil is so much a part. And it makes us seem less, I think this is especially important in Vancouver, and in the British Columbia context, it makes us seem less like relatively wealthy, mostly white, urban BCers who are concerned either about the survival of cute animals, or charismatic megafauna, or tourist vistas, and puts it more on the table as in this is a concern about a larger system in which we're all embedded. So I think that's a plus, certainly about framing the problem of oil on the coast in terms of climate change as opposed to just a fear of spills, which seems to me to be one of the dangers we might learn from witnessing what's going on in the Gulf, is that we end up worried about, to some extent, what is, in Kurt's word, a symptom. So if we come back to these two ways of thinking about oil on the coast, one is a fear of spills, one being the problem of larger climate change. And on the first hand, we have a reasonably obvious, if very difficult, policy achievement to which we can work, which is tanker ban, continued moratorium on offshore drilling, the end of the possibility of oil on our coasts. That would be the dream policy outcome, and the political action would be oriented toward achieving that. But policy options for the second reasons around global climate change are clearly much more complicated. The ideal policy option is, of course, leave it in the ground, change the way we run the world, no more fossil fuels, let's do things differently. And I can say that very easily, but that's a much trickier thing to pull off, of course. Which is part of the reason why I think we find our politics, and I'm stating the obvious here, part of the reason we find our politics straying back toward the local. Because the local is where we find, at least those of us who are caught up in this, which I would probably guess is most of you, is where we find people eliciting some sort of engaging response, right? When we bring climate change home by saying, this could happen, these pictures, terrifying pictures, could happen here. We make the local sort of speak for the global. And that is a really good reason to focus on the local. But at the same time, we can't take the chance that we then put up our feet. Say we achieve a tanker ban. Say we get a committed legislative long-term moratorium on offshore oil drilling or exploration in British Columbia. Say we get that tomorrow. The fear is that then here in BC, we clap ourselves on the back, put our feet up and have a beer because we've done our work. And we need to embed, I would argue, the problem in a much larger framework so that the work is continued once we're done, if we can achieve this here, which I think we can. So, in other words, we need to, I think, have both reasons in mind. We need to fight tankers and oil exploration on the coast for the reasons that the Macondo spill makes so obvious, but we also need to consistently embed our politics in the larger fight against climate change. And so thinking about, just for today, just thinking about the Gulf disaster and the kinds of issues it's raised, I just wanted to mention maybe a few political or policy options that are not coming up maybe as often as they should, perhaps I'm just not in the right conversations, that aren't just about banning tankers or continuing the moratorium on offshore drilling, which you may or may not know we have right now. We have in place a moratorium on offshore oil exploration and drilling, and we have a basically unenforced tanker ban on the North Coast that we're hoping to turn into a legislative long-term ban. And the policy options that I want to maybe just suggest, I think hopefully will articulate kind of the local concerns with oil on our coasts, but also with a larger climate change politics. So one of the more obvious things we can do, and this has been a big part of what Dogwood does. Now I should say that I come today partly as the chair of the Dogwood board. I'm not speaking for Dogwood in any way. A couple of times I'll reflect on their experiences, but I should say that the Dogwood board does not make strategy. The staff does all the fantastic work the organization does. I happen to support their work wholeheartedly, but I can't take any credit for it, and I also can't tell you that I thought it up. So that's something to keep in mind. But at any rate, one of the more obvious things we can do, I think, is to make all of this, all of the activity that we're talking about on the coast more and more expensive. And this could take several forms, I think, some of which are available within the existing policy framework, both federal and provincial. And we might call these various options, I'm going to call them sort of Harper possible, Harper maybe small chance, and then there's like no way in hell with Harper possibilities. And you can substitute Campbell if you feel like you're thinking provincially. But I would argue that for my purposes, it's the same thing. Now, for example, right now in Canada, we have no natural resource damage assessment mechanisms like those in operation in the US. We have no formal way of assessing damages and identifying those who merit compensation. So when the US government announced yesterday that it wanted BP to set aside $20 billion in a compensation fund, we have no way of doing that here in Canada. We can't make those same demands, and we have no formal way of assessing the costs or who that money would go to if we could do that. We also have no legislative capacity to ring fence that money, which the United States is definitely demanding. So setting aside $20 billion, but also making it so that if BP goes under, that $20 billion still stands. It doesn't disappear to creditors. So this would be a great policy shift that wouldn't solve the problem of oil, but it would certainly make the whole thing more expensive and would at least cover our asses a little bit better in the long run, in the short term, I would say. And I would add also that the Obama administration, for all its problems, is also made it clear to BP that this $20 billion has nothing to do with their liability for criminal charges or the costs of cleanup. So which are expected, so the total cost is expected to run up to $40 billion, and I'll bet you anything that's an underestimation. Secondly, and it's a similar but small demand, is the expectation that BP stop its dividend issue, which might sound like a kind of tiny financial technical issue, but last year BP's dividend issue was 40% of all the dividends issued in the whole of the UK. So this is a massive amount of money that's issued. So the fact that BP would hold its dividends back and not issue them to its mostly institutional investors is a statement to investors that you got to watch your ass, because you're going to lose money if you invest in a company like this. If we can send that message, that's a really powerful message. It certainly doesn't fix the world, but it makes the world much more expensive to mess with, which I think is a good thing.